Our journey of the last 4 weeks in imagining no racism has included the Bishop Mark Webb, Dr. Maisha Marzell, Angela Riley, Ph.D., and this morning, the prophet Micah. Not a bad lineup. So the question that is posed today that I would like to entertain with you for a few moments is this. So what's the bottom line? What's the bottom line over these past 4 weeks? What does the Lord require when it comes to our faith, our religion, our life, and even racism? In the midst of our human-made ideologies of being staunchly Republican or Democrats, staunchly being on the right or on the left, conservative or progressive, this morning God calls us beyond as we explore what the Lord requires of us. Now, to the prophet Micah, he was asking and considering perhaps God requires burnt offerings of calves and rams and rivers of oil and even the sacrifice of children. Now, we progressive, learned people living in this time scoff at that. We sneer at that. How can they think that way? But all the time, we still develop our own man-made, women-made mandates, rules, interpretations, requirements, and convolute them into God's requirements. I was struck when I heard and read this week the words of Vance Morgan, one of my favorite authors. He wrote this little ditty this last week that kind of clarifies that, and I'll quote him. Quote, "White supremacists use the Bible to justify their racism. The only problem with that is that there are no white people in the Bible." End quote. So let's take a careful look. Let's take a very careful look at what the Lord requires. But I'm going to put it in front of you in a different order. I think Micah's cool, but I'm going to change his order this morning. What does the Lord require? First, to love kindness. I begin with the personal dimension, something we can all agree on, knowing that we are all called to be that good Samaritan. But here's where it gets tough. In the Old Testament, 23rd chapter of Exodus, verse 5, it says this. "If you see the donkey of someone who hates you lying helpless under its load, don't walk off and leave it. Help it up." Well, maybe you're not an Old Testament person. Let's go to the New Testament. Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 44. It says this. "You're familiar with the old written law, love your friend, and its unwritten companion, hate your enemy. But I'm challenging that," says Jesus. "I'm telling you to love your enemies. Let them bring out the best in you, not the worst." That's where it gets tough. God requires us to love kindness, just not with those we find it easy, but those who challenge us, those that we find it difficult to shower with kindness. Those we don't understand, we are to love kindness. Those whose ideologies are different than ours, we are to be kind. Those whose lifestyles seem foreign to us, those that we have little in common with, we are called, we are required, we are demanded to be kind to them. Someone once asked, if throughout your life you are given $1 for every kind word and deed that you said or did to someone, but had to give back 50 cents for every unkind deed or word, overt or covert, at the end of your life, would you be rich or poor? God calls us to love kindness so that we do justice. This is the social dimension that loves kindness for a reason, for a purpose, that works for equity and equality for all. Now, for the prophet Micah, it was fairness for the powerless, laborers, and the oppressed. Friends, nothing's changed. That is our call also. The call remains the same, especially today as we stand before our hallowed flag this weekend and pledge our allegiance and proclaim liberty and justice for all. My fear is that sometimes the church is merely content with just kindness, and many times offers a blind eye toward justice. The Lutheran pastor Edward Marquardt reminds us of the distinction between kindness and justice in a story from Charles Dickens' England of 200 years ago. I'd like to read it to you. During that time, in England, many 12-year-old boys were working in coal mines, down in the dangerous mine shafts. Their life was miserable, but that was what was expected of a 12-year-old boy during that time, especially if they were a part of a poor family in that part of England. It was a lifetime of hard work that began as a child. Oh, the church tried to be kind to those boys. They'd offer presents at Christmas time and give their families holiday turkeys at Thanksgiving. The church would even offer prayers while they were gone in the mines. Until one day, one church leader worked on passing a much-needed law. The law said that little boys could no longer work in the coal mines. The law also insisted that these boys go to school. And that, my friends, is the difference between acts of kindness and doing justice. Kindness is giving Christmas presents to disadvantaged boys in coal mines. Kindness is giving their families a turkey at Thanksgiving. Kindness is praying for them. Doing justice is working to change the laws so that it is illegal for little boys to work in the coal mines in the first place. As we do all we do as a community of faith, may we never lose sight that God requires a kindness that leads towards justice. This justice, indeed, is more complicated, messy, problematic, and complex than mere kindness. And it forces us to put others ahead of ourselves. That's not a real popular theme in our culture these days. But it is a theme lived out and died for by our Savior, Jesus. We are called to love kindness that leads to justice. And as we do all of that, we're called to walk humbly with our God. Can you see that? In your mind's eye, can you see your life walking humbly with God? Can you imagine it? Can you become it? Simply walking with, alongside God. The very first command Jesus gave his disciples was what? Follow me. Follow me. In other words, walk with me. But God requires us to do the same in the spirit of humility. I end with this. Perhaps very apropos to wrap up these 4 weeks. I share the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who in my study this week has redefined for me my definition of humility. As he speaks of the humility of God in which we are to mimic. This is what he once wrote. The greatness of God lies in the fact that God is tough-minded and tender-hearted. God has qualities both of austerity and of gentleness. The Bible expresses God's tough-mindedness when it comes to justice and God's tenderness when it comes to his grace. God has two outstretched arms. One is strong enough to surround us with justice, and one is gentle enough to embrace us in grace. I am thankful we worship a God who is both tough-minded and tender-hearted. If God were only tough-minded, God would be a cold, passionless despot sitting in some far-off place. But if God were only tender-hearted, he would be too soft and sentimental to function when things go wrong. Thank the Lord for a God who is tough-minded enough to transcend the world, but yet tender-hearted enough to live within it. Humility. Being tough-minded for the cause of justice, and tender-hearted to truly care that there is liberty and justice for all. So what's the bottom line? To love kindness that leads to justice as we walk humbly with our God.